Greetings everyone. We are going to be covering chapter 16 today, which talks about public relations, managing cross-national conflict shifts. In other words, you have some companies that have issues. You have your parent company and then they have issues with foreign subsidiaries or branches of the company and how the communication is being handled. So let's take a look at this. We're going to start, high-tech flip chart here. We're going to start with the overview. Within the overview, obviously, you have your home base, and then you have your branch offices in different countries. So that's one of the first things they address in terms of the chapter. Well, they talk about the problems in terms of public relation and communication. Different countries obviously do things differently. Different culture, different way of life, different standards, different structures, different unions, the way workers are handled. So they talk about some of the challenges within the bigger companies. There is a case study that is being addressed, and that case study is DuPont. DuPont, in the early 2000s, they manufactured children's toys with lead-based paint. Their regulations were not the same as the United States, and it became an issue because people's children were getting sick. But the problem was that the way the communication was handled. DuPont did not address the problem initially. There was a delay, plus there was some blame shifting going on. So the chapter, the writers talk about that as a case study. All right, let's talk about TNO, transnational organizations. When you're dealing with cross-national conflicts, they wanted to study, well, let's look at the structure for communication. Is it centrally located? Is it, what's the chain of command, the division of responsibility? How is it handled in terms of public relations, in terms of company communications in general? All right, one of the challenges is that you have the internet. The internet makes communication virtually immediate. So if you have someone who has a problem, say mothers have a problem with their children's toys, then they can go right on the internet, and this can have a negative effect on the companies. And it's a matter of how are the companies going to respond. Well, the companies need to address certain things. They need to recognize the distance between their subsidiaries and their branch offices, as well as the market size, competition, and authority. How much authority should the home base have, or how much authority should the leaders in the foreign countries have? So this was an issue. The chapter was broken down into three main parts. The literary reviews, so they wanted to research what has been published already in terms of communication with these big companies, and then they offer some presuppositions for further research. If someone is going to continue the research, what are some suggestions? And then they talk throughout about lessons learned in terms of communication between these major companies. Okay, let's dive right in. So, first of all, they wanted to identify, well, where is the power? Where does the power reside? Does it reside with the parent company in the home base? Or is it more of a local thing? And how much is given to each? Is there a standard for the company? Japanese car makers, they may work differently than, say, people in the West. So how much autonomy do they give to the local teams? Some of the management factors, they talked about the size and location, the technology that's being used, the product that's being used, financial performance, expectations and things like that. That all comes into play in terms of communication. The research, the studies, again, they talked about the organization structure. They talked about the centralization, the need, how effective and how efficient they were, allowing for flexibility. When you're dealing with different companies, then flexibility is going to become an issue. You can't just work like robots. So when they talked about setting up this model, they identified the differences, and then they also took a look at the locations and also the relationships with nearby countries. For example, if you have some countries, say Japan or China or Taiwan, some of these countries may have similarities and their business models are similar, but they may be very different from the West. So they want to see if they need to set up a standard communication paradigm or whether they can do things regionally and make some adjustments accordingly. In terms of setting up the model, the researchers they implemented really these 4 aspects in terms of coordination. This idea of trust, commitment, conflict, and satisfaction. And they gave an example of the United States, their relationship with Canada, and also the United States' relationship with Mexico. And they said, are they the same or are they different? Because you're dealing with 2 different governments. So they wanted to compare and contrast those. In terms of the way the communication models are set up, you really have the 2 parties. So you can either first have a sense of a split control. You guys have some control, the parent company, and then the subsidiary will have some control. Or everything is shared. But the problem with sharing everything is sometimes you'll have so much bureaucracy, so many small things that could be handled at the local level. So sometimes that wasn't the best model. Or you have the partner dominant, which is the parent company, or you have the local partner, which carries most of the load. So those were the management arrangements that were included in the chapter. Socialization, they talked about this idea of flexibility because some countries are very open and they just relate differently than perhaps they do in the West. So they wanted to identify rapid response. Sometimes that's a better option than simply, again, sending everything to the main corporate office and risking this time lapse, which, you know, in an internet culture, that can be deadly. All right. And then they talked about the models applying a degree of control. Sometimes if you do set up a standard, then you just kind of expect the others to take a responsibility and be accountable and say, well, this is what the standard is, so everyone needs to adjust to that standard. Sometimes that's the best way to work, but maybe not always. Sometimes you do have to find a balance. Okay, a couple more slides talking about this chapter. Conflict sharing. There was a problem. Sometimes you'll have one country in conflict with another country, and then it'll become an issue in the press, in the news, and then that can be a headache for the major company when you have, you know, regional or neighborly countries that have issues, others being irresponsible. Maybe they're dumping waste or they're doing something that is offensive, and then that can be a headache for, you know, the parent company on the other side of the world. So they talk about those. And then they talk about testing, you know, some propositions. What are some things that can be addressed in terms of the magnitude of the problem, boycotting products, people, you know, acknowledging that, hey, there's a problem here, and what do we do to address the problem? They gave an example of female safety in Mexico. Is that something that's addressed by the investigative reporters, or is it something that companies can jump ahead with and say, well, let's kind of predict the problem so that we can address them? Or, you know, if problems do arise, how do we react to them? There was a study that took place in South Africa. There was a bribery issue, and the writers analyzed how it was dealt with in terms of the local news, and then how it was influenced in terms of the US and Europe as well. So again, it's the idea of communication. How is it dealt with internationally? What's the effect? What's the influence from the US or from Europe? And then we talked briefly about the DuPont, the China conflict, the problem. Again, there was some blame shifting going on. They were lapsed in terms of the response, and it made the company look bad. It made it look like they didn't have a unified voice, so that became an issue. Some of the last things they talked about in the chapter was this idea of what did the literature have in common? What were some of the interconnections? And they mentioned that there is a need for a standardized voice coming out of the parent company and a unified voice. That is something that has to be established, you know, within the corporation. And then they all talked about the localization in some subsidiary. You know, it's not for them not to have certain allowances, because there needs to be flexibility in different cultures, and also the need for collaboration was important. Okay, the last slide talks about some propositions, some guiding points in terms of research in the future for people that want to continue to do research in terms of communications at the corporate level, internationally, standardization over centralization, some of the things that haven't been studied that can be published and studied some more. All right, blessings to you all. That was chapter 16, and I hope all is well. Take care, bye.